Yeah, that's right. Pinch hitter. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, off doing something fun?
He's flying back. Yeah, he was actually part of the Notre Dame football game on Saturday.
Oh.
His dad and his son.
Oh my.
And then the Packer game yesterday. And I think his plane touches down at 10 a.m. this morning.
So that does sound like fun.
Hey, Sean? Good?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, so it was, I think they were looking at colleges, I think mainly.
No, it's just our bigger chair.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
I said, I
So
said,
the
no, no more.
agenda was basically.
On strike.
Okay.
Needs to be it.
So like, okay.
Hello.
How are you? Sorry about that. How was the weekend?
Good morning.
Yeah.
How are you?
Pretty quiet.
Very quiet.
Except for those Seahawks. We don't let us down.
Oh, man.
Yeah, but the Huskies and the Stars.
No, can you believe that? We almost had a trifecta, but.
Yeah, you know, I was so thrilled with LSU won, I was happy with that.
That's right, that's right. Everybody had to be respectful of that.
And really, obviously, Washington beat UNC.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that Sark is on his way out down there.
He's got some problems, I guess.
So he did,
Yeah.
he's got the shoes.
Did you just get there?
It takes about a year.
Yeah, right, I just thought we hadn't been there that long,
He's
right?
having a personal issue.
I'm there.
The alternative isn't much better.
That's what somebody said.
Thanks for asking.
Is that clock slow up there?
Yes,
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it is.
that popped over there, right?
Yeah, my cell phone just said it's 9:30, so we're going to call this meeting to order. This is a workshop, October the 12th. And we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. And Jim, how about your Pledge of Allegiance this time? I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And the first thing we'll do is entertain a motion to approve the October 12th workshop agenda.
So moved. Second.
And we have a motion by Ms. Johnson and a second by
Rick and Heather.
Rick Hanold. Mr. Hanold, any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Say nay. Hearing none, unanimously, the agenda is approved. This is a workshop. We are not taking any action. And we will start out with the presentation of the workshop. Paul, you want to take it from there, please?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to begin with a few comments before Paul's presentation. I'd like to mention that we did have a public budget forum, proposed budget forum on October 6th. Very light turnout. We did have Jill and Jackie present for that forum. This presentation is what was presented at that forum. And following this presentation, I would suggest that the board either continue with questions, or if the board would like, go through department by department, whatever the board chooses. But I wanted to have Paul present first that presentation from the forum, and then we can move forward from there.
Okay.
So first of all, our budget schedule is listed here. You can see in June through August, I've been working on the budget with other department managers, even into early September, and the director. And we've identified our priorities and put them down on paper. In September, we put out the first draft of the budget, and October 6th, as was already mentioned, we had a public forum with already a draft 2, and then it's been updated again, draft 2.2, which we're going to be discussing today. October 23rd, we're planning to do another budget review at our regular board meeting. November 9th, during our workshop, we're planning to do a formal public hearing. And then November 30th, a review again, December 14th for final approval. So that's what we've laid out on the calendar so far. Of course, it's all subject to change, but there you have a budget schedule.
And hard copies were presented to everybody. also.
Yeah, there's a hard copy of that. And these slides also went up on the web, so you can get it there. Goals of this presentation is to explain the new budget format, list major assumptions, discuss any data that feels pertinent, answer budget questions, and receive feedback and ideas. This background, I'm sure everyone here knows this, but as you know, Island Transit's nonprofit PTBA, covering Island County, governed by the board of directors. And we currently have 104 employees. That includes managers, supervisors, mechanics, support staff, dispatchers, and bus operators.
Do you know what the previous staffing level was? Just out of curiosity.
At what time frame?
Before the layoffs,
Yeah.
it was 120 something.
What did you say, Robin?
I think it was about 124.
I know at one point, Paul, you did an in-depth analysis of the number of employees in order to get an accurate percentage. I'm sure you could dig that up if you.
Yeah, if you
I
really
was
like to know
just
it.
kind of a curiosity more than anything else.
We made some improvements to the format. The goal is to make the budget more readable, clearer, more transparent, etc. And the first format improvement that we made was account explanations. We updated those and tried to make them a lot clearer.
Can I ask you a question here, Paul? And this is for you too, Kim. When you go through this with your department heads, they get the department head or the department first crack at this thing. Do you then do your surgery on that department head budget and do your, I'm going to refer to the term as your chop job?
Yeah, the process is kind of an iterative process, whereas where I really started everything was I went back and looked at all the expenses in 2014 by department, by account, and looked at what we were spending there. And then I sent that to department heads with the detail and the summary. They reviewed their each account and the expenses that they had happened and what they anticipated for the future. And then the corrections were brought back to me where I would do what you were calling major surgery. Then, as things changed, it was updated. We talked about it, of course, with the director and department heads in kind of an iterative way. If I had a question, or it might go back to them, and if there were new estimates that came forward, that would be inserted into the budget. And I probably talked with department heads a number of times, probably 2 or 3 times, and sent out updates so that they could review it. And if they had any questions or concerns with it, then it would come back to me. And, you know, then part of the process was also trying to link it to the capital asset schedule and comparing with the TDP. So there were a number of comparisons and links to other documents to see, you know, if there were any problems along the way. And then it came back to our, you know, of course, our finance committee looked at it at least once. I know I've spoken with Jim a couple times with
Individual items.
individually.
And Jill too.
And Jill.
Jill and I both have had a couple of finance meetings where this was on the agenda for us to review. We tended to review, I think, more, there have been some changes in revenue too, which a couple of were unexpected, fairly dramatic. One of the funds that we've had for years wasn't renewed by the legislature, and that was just in the cracks. I mean, so.
Yeah, it didn't renew as of the end of, you know, starting July 1st.
Well, that leads to my next question then too. Did all of you on the finance committee and Paul and Ken look at our predictable, realistic revenue source and work backwards from there?
Yeah, absolutely. That was one piece of beginning the process, was to look at our revenue sources. One of those revenue sources, which was we got this quarterly tax amount from Olympia, apparently wasn't renewed in the last legislative session, but it didn't surface until the next payment, which would have been September, end of September. So, you know, I just tracked it down and realized what it was. And then again, another update to the budget. So it's kind of an iterative process sometimes like that, and that's what I've been following and trying to keep as detailed and up to date as possible. And when a major change happens like that, then I'll report it or send it out to, of course, the director, and then if there's a manager that's involved or the finance committee that's involved, I'll try to keep them up to date on it.
On the revenue side, I think was closely reviewed this year than I've seen done, because we reviewed every single fund that we were expecting. A couple of the funds, fortunately, were a little bit bigger, and they somewhat compensated for the third equalization fund that wasn't renewed. But I think Paul stuck just to assured revenue. It doesn't even include estimates at this point for revenue that might come from charging fares and the kind.
So, and we are, I hope, I shouldn't make a statement, rather I should ask the question. The strategy is to be very conservative
Oh, absolutely.
on the revenue projection side.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that, but that is underlying this budget. Everything's really conservative.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could elaborate on Paul's comments, there were at least two phases, and I think there's a third phase even, that where the department heads review their budgets as presented by Paul. They came to me, and I discussed with Paul. We made changes, went back for further review by the department heads. It would come back to me. I would say, okay, or these changes need to be made, and go back to Paul. We did that at least 3 times, and then had individual meetings with department heads to come up with what we have today. So it's, I think it's been a very thorough process, and I think we came up with realistic numbers.
Okay. I'm sure we'll have additional questions as well.
Oh, yeah.
Another format improvement that we've built into the budget was separating operating and capital revenues and expenses. And this is an example of that separation that exists on the first page of the budget, or what's listed as a budget resolution. You can see on the top it's showing operating, and the second section is capital. Another less obvious improvement that I think is taking place is how the information flows through the budget. We're going from the detailed to the summary, and never losing sight of those account lines. So last year, we went from detailed to summary, from account line to department, and so it was less obvious as to how you could trace that information back. So just made that change as well. And you can see on this slide that, you know, the departments are shown in detail. So for every department like 100 or 101, 103, it has this list of accounts, and then in the summary you have the same list of accounts. Another improvement is adding an extra year of data. So instead of just 2 years of data, we're going with 3 years, whereas 2015 is showing budget and projected actual. So you have 4 columns, but 3 years of data. Another improvement is unused accounts. So we're showing accounts that aren't used as grayed out, just to show the complete picture, and it's a way to just have more transparency.
Well, it also keeps the department pages the same.
Consistent.
Yeah.
Also, another improvement is showing an accounting for reserve accounts. So I put reserve accounts where we've already sold vehicles and where we intend to, or where we have put that money, and then also showing how we plan to save for future capital expenditures. And so you can see we have a bus reserve, a van reserve, support vehicle reserve, other capital, which would be non-vehicle, contingency, which the number of board members had mentioned at the last meeting, and then general operating, which would be what we use every day. Just it's less restricted funds, which would basically be the balance or the remainder of what's not in reserve for other purposes.
So when we talked about having a goal of 3 months operating cash in reserve, you would see that in the contingency line?
Yeah. It would just pull it out of the general operating, and it would be set aside for emergencies or other purposes. General operating is basically, the idea there is any item that needs to be spent in the current month for payroll or other expenditures would come out of that fund.
Yeah. One of the bumps in the annual calendar is that in December we have a slightly larger operating carryover because in January and February we get annual expenses that are bigger than average, and particularly the insurance, which is running now around $340,000.
Yeah, but if I go to your cover page, the resolution page, you're showing operating revenues $12,206,000.
That's right.
Operating expenses $10,513,000. So that means we have 2 million, or what was it, 1.6 million, almost $1.7 million
Yes,
excess.
that's right.
So that's money that should be in the
operating.
contingency, not in the everyday bank account.
Well, it goes in, part of that is for financing capital. You have to look at after the capital purchases of the year. But after the capital purchases, it's even greater because of just the way the capital money is cycling. So the general end of 2016 is greater than the beginning at the bottom of the page. But you're right, that surplus is what allows us to build the reserves.
Right, but it shouldn't be shown in an everyday, like it's an everyday checking account. It needs,
No.
the excess money needs to be put in that contingency. It needs to be set aside. As it stands right now, it makes us look like we've got a lot of money sitting there excess to play with.
But as Mr. Sundberg was saying, I think the first point is we have 1.6 coming netting from operations, but then there's the capital as well. So then, that would be reduced by what we would be planning on spending on capital and transferring reserves for capital. And then the net budget surplus in total, 63,000. I think it's prudent to say, well, maybe that should go into contingency, but I think that's a matter for the board. You need to decide that.
Well, in my opinion, if it's excess, it needs to go into that contingency, because if we don't start putting something in that contingency, we're never going to get to 3 months reserve that we need.
So I think, my idea would be is that money's going to contingency would just be decided by the board in a formal way, or the finance committee, or.
Let me add to that, Rick. Don't we have a restricted fund here?
That's what
The-
the contingency is.
The contingency should be a restricted fund, that we have a planned amount that goes into that fund that cannot be touched without the majority approval of the board.
Right.
That would mean, of course, this is a budget and this is a plan. It hasn't really been formally approved yet. So however you'd want to set that up, and that's the way we would do it.
I think
This is
for
a template.
our next board meeting, we should have a resolution that's approved or disapproved that sets up the restricted fund. At least sets the framework for putting that money in there. And, like Rick said, if we don't start doing it now, we're never going to get there.
Sure.
Right. Any excess funds
Well,
need to go in there until we get that reserve built. Because currently we have no reserve. Currently we're operating, basically it looks like we're operating out of a revolving account or a checking
Paycheck to
account.
paycheck.
Yeah. And so there needs to be, we need to set a precedent saying that X amount of dollars is going into this every month, or X% of our revenues are going in there every month. Just like an expense, until such time we have 3 months of operating reserves. If our monthly operating costs are, let's just say $1 million a month, we need $3 million in that reserve.
Okay.
That it can't be touched without board approval.
So I think there are possibly 2 ways we could go at that. One would be any excess would go into the reserve, or we could state a specific amount. So those are just 2 ideas.
Let me add to that, Rick. I believe it should be a scheduled amount that goes in there that gets us to the amount that we direct the staff to have X dollars in that restricted fund by such and such a date. That way, that is going to impact what we're spending money on as we go through, even looking at every department. That's a separate department that is just as important as all the other departments, if we want to get to that goal of having to set aside.
I think I would just recommend that the finance committee make a recommendation.
Sure.
on that process.
But we can start out with a resolution to establish that process. Fair enough? Come on, Jill, speak up.
well, I think that part of what we're gonna go through in this process is that, in my opinion, budgets are policy documents. They reflect your policy decisions. And so, I mean, one of the first things that you said was, I wrote it down, that we identified priorities. And so I guess my question as a board member is, what are they and how are they determined? And then the follow-on is, why aren't priorities, priorities are policy, policy driven. So to me, the priority should have come from the board and then gone out from there. So I'm going to be curious as we walk through this, what policy choices and priorities we've set for ourselves. What I hear the board saying is that building up that 3 months reserve is a priority. What I'm concerned about bringing a resolution forward which would specify a specific amount. I'm fine with the creation of the account. I don't know what that reserve is competing with right now. So if we're gonna set aside money at the expense of, you know, day-to-day operations, I wanna make sure that I'm clear that that's the choice that we're making. I don't wanna make the choice that says this is what we're gonna set aside and then all of a sudden have a consequence that we didn't see coming. And so, I mean, that's where my, a little bit of my hesitation is I think that both Rick and Rick are right, that we need to identify what we're gonna set aside and not just, you know, say, oh, well, we have this much left, so we'll put it in there. I think we should have a goal. But I'm also worried about tying our hands before we know what other choices we're making. I mean, I may say that the reserve is more important to me than technology upgrades, personally. But I don't know the significance of those technology upgrades to make that statement yet.
Let me add to that, Jill. When this board reformed to the format that we have now, we had a stabilization plan. And within that plan, the highest priority was to stabilize the financial position of this operation. We could go through all 6 of those. I think there were 6 points in that stabilization fund. And that's where policy was set. And I often think that we're kind of losing sight of that policy statement about our stabilization plan as we move forward. We've kind of gotten tied up into a lot of other details, and the big picture is the stabilization of this organization.
That can present lots of ways.
Yeah.
That certainly was my starting point on the finance subcommittee, was starting from those priorities, and I think we've met 2 or 3 of them. The stabilization plan addressed mostly, I think, financial priorities, and I think this budget did not begin, but does not go in, or this budget fits into that stabilization plan quite well. The idea of setting up a contingency fund came up at the last board meeting and is being implemented, and I think the finance subcommittee can bring forward in 2 weeks, no problem, a action proposal to fund the contingency fund. It will take time to build to a 3-year, to a 3-month operating size. But it's encouraging that every month we are generating a small surplus right now.
Okay, shall we move forward?
This budget is set up with a definite organization, and it's displayed in a sense in the budget summary page, which is the the 2.1 and 2.2 pages. But it basically follows this philosophy. You start with your beginning reserves, you add your operating revenues, subtract out your operating expenses, add your capital revenues, subtract your capital expenses, and then you'll have your ending reserve balances. So the idea here is to simplify and make just very simple the idea of in the organization of the budget document. So basically you take your beginning, your additions and subtractions, and you're left with your ending reserves.
Okay, now hold it there for just a second, Paul.
Okay.
With that formula, we're commingling the bottom line on the financial statement.
Well, you'll notice on that page, the 2.1, 2.2, that at every step of the way, we're showing those surpluses in each area.
category.
And then we have, of course, the bottom line.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
they're separate, but those separate pieces are part of the whole. So it's every piece is shown, and then the whole is shown.
Then do you consider capital reserves and capital reserves as a restricted fund?
Well, restricted can take on a lot of meanings, but they are reserves, and they're set aside for that purpose. restricted is a formal term that means you couldn't make any movement without formal approval. And that's, I think they are reserved for those purposes. And if the board approves that document, that restricts them or holds them for that purpose.
Well, the concern that I have, what I'm thinking about, and you probably have this base covered, is if we have a capital reserve that involves, these are the funds that we are going to apply to the schedule for, let's say, vehicle replacement, then the board never sees that again when it comes time to actually make those purchases. Are you considering that the approval of the budget is the approval of the expenditure of those funds for vehicles without coming back to the board?
You know, I think that the approval of the budget probably is the approval to expend that money, but I also think that, you know, the cash statement I issue each month shows the balance of those funds.
Now,
Also-
let me finish my line of thought here, Jim. My concern about that approach is that we are approving a number for a budget, and a budget is a guideline, and there's no demand or no pressure in not just Island Transit, but generally in government culture, that those funds are available to be spent no matter what, without the emphasis being on maybe we can spend this money differently on different vehicles or a different strategy. We never see that side of it. How do we beat that budget?
I think that there's another piece that I didn't mention, is that before we spend money, it has to be approved each month. So that sets a little closer watch on that funding or those expenditures. You know, we have those monthly vouchers. As far as, if it's being spent on bus A or bus B, like we had our plan to spend, say, on 5 buses, plan A, and you're saying perhaps it would change to 5 different buses or something like that.
There's a contract involved too, which the board approves the application for. For example, in buses, there's a contract for $800,000 that the board has approved, and that the agency has signed with the source of the funds. So the large capital expenditures come through the board first. They won't be in the budget unless they're in a contract.
Yeah, so we do have a contract for grants for a specific scope and specific types of buses. And then we try and align that with our capital improvement plan to replace the most needy replacement buses. So we've made that connection. And then we put into the budget for view and analysis. And then as those buses are purchased, they come back again to the board probably for final approval, because they would show up in that master voucher list. And I'm sure we would talk about it in this setting before we would even go that step. So there are a number of points where we can watch and check and possibly change the plan that is laid out in the budget.
I remember over the last year and a half, every grant application, I think just about every grant application, has come through for discussion with the board. The only one that didn't was one right at the end of the year where there wasn't another board meeting to have time to discuss it. But so the agency applied for the money, but then if the board didn't want to take the money for that purpose, we don't have to follow through.
Okay, Jim, I understand that, and Paul, I understand that also, but I want to go back and dig deeper into this, way ahead of the budget, but into the decision on what we're going to spend that capital category amount of money for it, and this is what's on my mind. We've talked about the possibility, as some other transit districts have been able to do, is contract out paratransit or go with smaller paratransit vehicles like vans. have we vetted the purchase of paratransit buses, the replacement of them, with a different strategy? Or are we just going lockstep in, this is what we did before, these are the types of vehicles we bought before, we're going through the state pool, this is available, we have the grant, we're just gonna keep doing it the way we used to do it? If we're gonna make any progress, we have to do things differently too. At least we have to consider different approaches, different strategies. Are we doing that, and is there a place in this budget process where we are going to do that?
There is a place for considering those options. The decisions need to be made upfront, early. I mean, first thing in the grant process, in order to know what funds we're applying for, and what types of vehicles, what types of services, and so on. Because once the scope for the grant is presented to the state, it's very difficult, if not impossible in some cases, to change that scope. So, as an example, a grant that we have in now for vehicles cannot be revised if we decide to do something else that changes the type of vehicle or changes how that vehicle is going to be used, because the grant has already been submitted and approved in that format by the state. So I would suggest that in the future, or I would suggest that there needs to be more consideration of the TDP and what that includes for future years, and any future planning that, or planning policies that the board has in mind, that those be developed very early on to future grant processes, where those considerations can be taken into account in the state grant process. But once the grant's been submitted, approved, with the various types of vehicles or other capital items included, we basically can't go back and change that grant. So the decision needs to be made early on, up front.
And so the discussion should happen early on, up
Yes.
front, and then discussion around the different options we might have. I mean, because you're right, once we get the grant, that's what the grant has to be used
Right.
for. So has that happened in the past, that the board has gotten, like, this is A, B, C, D are available, what should we go for, or have those discussions happened? I haven't been here long enough to know that.
I remember a detailed discussion about 6 months ago where we went through bus by bus as to whether the replacement capital, which is the main item in this budget that's not operations, is replacement. We discussed the mileage, the age, and the condition of the transit buses, the van pool buses, and the paratransit vehicles. Now, at that time, maybe we didn't have some of your ideas ready, but we did go, and that's why this was an attachment to the 6-year capital development plan. That doesn't mean that we can't develop new policies.
So the budget, you're saying the budget
Reflects.
Capital
Yeah.
expenditure for the budget is already reflected in this budget. Excuse me, let me restate that. The purchase of new vehicles, for example, through the grant system is reflected in this budget. And those grants have been approved? Okay.
Could
A
I,
couple years ago.
They're
perhaps
locked
it,
in.
perhaps it might make it easier, okay? Where you're showing, beginning reserves or whatever, okay? Capital revenues. First line, 13 buses, 1,294,000. That grant money?
That is.
So perhaps if that was a different color, and let you know that that revenue is grant money, then you come down here, transfer from bus reserve. That is our match. So maybe you could color code it or something like that, where it's showing that this is grant money, because I understand where you're coming from. We approved, we did a resolution in here and authorized the purchase of these vehicles after great discussion. and accepted the grants, or we applied for the grants, we have a reserve, or a match that we have to meet. That's coming from our bus reserve and our van reserve that,
There's a sheet that shows all that though, that's
Yeah.
not
There's a
summary.
narrative on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My only question on this slide is that when we get, if we just look at ending reserves, all I want to make sure is that we don't offset capital revenues with operating revenues, or capital, or operating revenues with capital revenues without this board knowing that we've interchanged money between the two accounts.
Right.
So what I don't want to do is look at ending reserve and say, oh, we're doing great, and one of those funds is operating at a loss and being subsidized by the other fund, because that's where we ran into some troubles, I believe. So I see how this is painting a picture of the entire organization. I just want to make sure that in our process, that the board is always aware of movement between operating revenues and capital revenues to cover expenses in either one of those categories. To me, that's the big conversation right here.
yeah, and to add that, I don't think that you should be able to move from one to the other without board approval, and ending reserves should be restricted money. If it's a reserve, that's not operating money, that's not money in the bank that you can write a check on. A reserve is money set aside for future use.
But I should try to
This
throw out
budget does
there.
that. This budget very carefully separates those.
I understand, I'm just saying on that flow chart right there
Well,
where
this is kind of a
Summary.
oversimplification.
This is like a philosophy behind the budget, but I just need to add that every time we make a match, we're commingling operating and capital, because we're taking operating money and paying part of those capital expenditures. So we can't totally separate the two.
Well, no,
What
no.
this,
But why not?
Well, hi, talking before you.
Okay.
Okay. It's like I'm married all the time. Sorry.
You're married together, Rick.
I am. I understand what you're saying. First, I think that it's the word reserves that's the problem. So it's like a beginning fund balance, right? And then it's an ending fund balance. And then when you say reserves, then you're saying savings account. So what we're saying is we start with the amount of money in our checking that we carry forward. And then we have our operating, then we have our capital, and then we end with a certain amount of money in our checking account still. And in order for it to become a restricted reserve, we need to make the determination to transfer that to savings. Otherwise, it stays in checking. So that's just really fund balance. When we agree to our capital revenues in this budget, though, then we're allocating that transfer from operating to capital. So there is a board decision in there that says we're going to take these operating revenues and use them for capital expenditures. What I just want to make sure is that we don't overcommit on capital and begin that transfer to operating, and then all of a sudden, oh, hey, we can't make payroll because we bought 250 buses, right? That was the issue. The issue everyone wants to avoid is a fancy building and no money for payroll. That's what we're trying to avoid.
I think one way to look at it in more detailed side to make sure that that doesn't happen is you look at your ending reserves against your operating reserves, and if we see the operating reserve continue at the same rate or greater, and we're setting enough money aside for capital, we'll be fine. In other words, if your general operating fund is increasing, that flow of money is not going to the capital reserves. You're keeping what you have and perhaps adding to it. And if we're also, in addition, putting aside money for capital, we should be fine. And the budget details that out. Here, just for 1 year, but the TDP did the same thing, year by year, showing that the transfers of monies either to capital funds or reserves is talked about here for both operating and capital.
So the purpose of the TDP, of the 6-year plan, is to show that any transfers that are built in, that are implicit in that plan are sustainable.
That's right.
And that's why I say our financial recovery goals have been met this year and exceeded, because we generated a surplus that exceeded what we had planned.
Okay, can I clarify one thing there? And I'm not trying to be your husband or wife and jumping in here, but.
I was
keep-
quiet.
That's okay. If we were at home, I'd just go to another room and go, huh? Anyway, and Jim, and I'm sorry, because you keep saying that we have, that we keep generating, the word generating more revenue than we're spending. That is not true. Right now, we are not spending as much as we budgeted for because fuel is at 50% the price of what we budgeted for.
Correct.
And that is where our excess is coming from. And everybody knows it and sees it. You can see it in black and white. Gas prices are going to start rising. The price of oil went back up over $50 a barrel the other day. Holidays are coming. Fuel prices are going to go up. I see them being back up to $3.20 by mid-November. But that being said, we're keeping an even keel, and we are ahead this year. That does not mean that with the revenues we have coming in that we're going to continue. I don't want to paint this rosy picture that we're recovering and we're making this, we're generating revenue. We are not generating anything. What's keeping us alive is a $2.3 million grant from the state and the price of gas. Okay, so when we say we're generating the revenue, it's misleading to the public and misleading to other parties that we're dealing with. Okay, we are not generating any excess revenue. We're barely staying alive.
It's a point well taken. And I don't think I said generating revenue. What I said is there's a small surplus every month that could go into a restricted contingency fund that we can implement what Joe is talking about.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing to do.
Yes, and
So I
that,
think we agree.
yeah, that was my other point. My other point is I can't see if we have excess money, and call it your reserve, call it your checking account, call it whatever you want, any excess money in there that we don't need to pay the bills for this month and the following month, or the next month's bills, that should be going into a contingency fund or a reserve fund, however you want to label it, but something that is untouchable without board approval.
Sure. It's right now, it's
Right now, it's
ongoing
floating around
work.
in a
Well,
checkbook.
it's an ongoing work in progress because the request and suggestion that we have a restricted contingency fund is one that came up last
Why?
official board meeting. I mean, we've
We've
set up,
talked about it several times.
well, we set up the 3 capital reserves.
Mhm.
Buses, vans, and support vehicles. And now we're setting up a contingency fund reserve that is over and beyond that.
And I think that's an important point, and I think part of where I get nervous when we talk about the health of the organization, which I believe is healthy, is when we say, well, we have funds in excess, our operating funds are in excess of our expenses. In my mind, until that 3 months reserve is in place, we're still behind the 8 ball. So to me, when our capital reserves are met and our operating reserve is met, then if we're generating additional revenue, I think our message is, you know, we're in a safe financial position. But until then, to me, the 3 months that is not restricted is an unmet liability that we have. And so I look at that as money that needs to be invested to ensure that stability. And so I think that's what we've kind of been talking around is a while, is that terminology maybe is, I don't think that we're operating with any profit until we have 3 months stabilization in place and we're meeting all of our obligations. And then at that point, we've got revenue to discuss how we want to spend.
Yeah, and I'd just say, the 6-year plan doesn't show any profit. It ends with the same amount of money that it begins with. And that's why it could be approved, because it doesn't show a gradual growth. It shows a stability and a replacement of aging vehicles as needed. And this should approximately do the same. I mean, the ending amount is a tiny amount compared to the monthly expenditure. But we can certainly reclassify in terms of terminology, what is now being called the operating reserve that is carried over.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think any surplus that we have will roll into general operating reserve as we have done in the past, or if we set up another reserve title fund, you might call it, you could put it there. So it's kind of like how you're chopping it up. You could say, well, I'm putting it into this contingency fund, which is restricted or whatever, and approved by the board for movement to and from that fund. Whereas before, what we did is we had it in this general operating fund to meet various large expenses, like we had mentioned, the WISTIP, $350,000 in a particular fund where the timing of our expenditures varies greatly, so we would have that general operating money ready and available to spend that money. Whereas if it was in a contingency fund, we would have to seek formal approval to pull it back and then spend it.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
I think we're still not saying the same thing, which is what's making me a little nervous. I understand the checking concept of where we would keep money in there and that that's available for big expenses, and maybe we want to do some, set asides or acknowledgement that we have these big expenses coming out. But what I'm talking about in that contingency fund, and I think that it just needs to be called restricted operating reserve, is that there's 3 months in there that is the minimum amount that this organization keeps, and it never is touched. And so you build that up to 3 months operating. In fact, as your operating costs increase, you would add to that. And that money is not, you don't pull it out to make big payments, and you don't add money to it. It is simply a stabilization fund. It earns interest, and you hope that never in the organization's history do you need to go to it. So contingency to me means that you set funds aside in recognition that there's always going to be something you didn't see coming. So I'm fine with the contingency fund, but I think until our operating reserves are met, and even to a degree our capital reserve are met, that we should look at those reserves as liabilities that we need, that we're obligated to spend money on, separate from how we would move money to pay for like the WISTIP payment or different types of things. I think, and I don't want to speak for the whole board, but I'm pretty sure that I'm hearing us correctly in that what we're saying is that we want to see 3 months of operating cash set aside before we can declare this organization stable.
Jill, excuse me, I understand what you're saying. I think, let me reiterate it. We currently, in this budget, we have the WISTIP information, or the WISTIP budget included in the budget already out of operating funds. You are saying that we should, or yes, that we should have funds above the known budgeted amounts year to year. That the reserve fund is totally separate from anything that we're going to need to do during the operating year, above and beyond what we're planning for in the operating year.
Right.
I think you see a lot of heads nodding.
But that money and money that's put aside, and you can use it, invest it.
Isn't that what we said we wanted to call it contingency last time around?
Above and beyond.
I don't think we call it a contingency.
Contingency is for unexpected expenses. I call it a reserve, okay? A restricted reserve. This is your savings account. In case everything falls apart, we have no revenue coming in whatsoever, we can operate for 3 months off our savings account if we have to.
A restricted account.
Yes.
And this is a question for legal, for counsel. Don't we have to have a resolution that establishes a restricted account for that purpose?
Every time you have establish a separate fund, you need a resolution to do that.
And that's why I'm thinking that without identifying the amount, we can have a resolution that says the board has voted, or not voted, on this, establishing this fund, and then we can fill in the pieces. I think we can fill in the pieces, even today. To me, that today, buying wheels for the buses, or let me restate this, having this stabilization fund, the restricted stabilization fund, is every bit as important, maybe even more important, than buying wheels, tires for some of the buses. If we go, we have to be safe with the buses. It may be a bad example here, but it's just as important as every other account in there if we're going to get to the stabilization fund. If we're going to get to that point, we can go, you can't get there by going $50,000 a month at a time. Well, it's going to take us until who knows when to get there. If that amount, if the goal is $3 million, if that's our 3-month operating target, then we have to set up a schedule that says we are going to get there by such and such a date. And we have to start planning for that in our budget today, or we don't get there.
So just as revenues are, or projected revenues are a given in the budget planning process, we would have that X number of dollars of contingency as a given in the budget planning process, just like revenues or any other amounts that we build into the starting point of the budgeting process. The contingency is, we know what that amount is, so the budget has to be developed to ensure that that amount is
That's
left
right.
at the end of the budget planning process.
And we don't get there unless we, correct me if I'm wrong, council, we have to have that resolution that says this is what we're going to do, and this is how or when we're going to do this. Otherwise, we're still going to be carrying on this conversation every time we have a workshop on budgets. Your thoughts, Councilor?
My thoughts are a couple things. Every expenditure, and I just had a sidebar with Ken about this, about what staff's, the limits of staff's contractual authority, and I think it's $20,000. Any expenditure over and above that, the board has to approve. And although I haven't been to a meeting in a while, I've seen the agendas, and the agendas will include a consent agenda with all the expenditures, and any board member is free to take one item off the agenda if they don't want to do it. The way I've always viewed this is a budget is a target, and a lot of times I see organizations will have, when there's a recommendation for a purchase, whether it's a contracting for services or buying something, they'll note the budget impact, that there's, this has already been budgeted for. And board approval is required if there's something over and above that, if the budget's not already, but just as a matter of course, the board gets to approve every expenditure. What I hear the board saying is, in addition to that, as really as a policy statement, we would like to have a resolution stating that a reserve fund is critical to the long-term interest of the agency, and as a result, we're setting, and I haven't heard the numbers, and I think there probably wants to be some discussion about that, whether it's a dollar amount or percentage is set aside. That would be, staff and the board would treat that as a restricted fund, and monies couldn't be spent out of that fund without board approval. That's certainly within the board's purview to do that. And what I would recommend is Mr. Hendricks, when he's back in the saddle, probably works with staff and the finance subcommittee to draft a resolution for the board's consideration.
And this is an on-paper restriction. I mean, that's also part of what, I mean, it's a restriction that says that this money is for this purpose. It doesn't, in my mind, need to be an entirely separate bank account that you're managing. It's a restricted use of a certain amount of money.
Identifiable fund.
Yeah.
Right,
Mhm.
okay. Because I'm not trying to get bureaucratic, I'm just trying to get stable.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, I think we were talking about the same thing, it's just the terminology. Contingency was that other
Yeah.
reserve fund, and whether we call it restricted operating, or contingency. It really was the same idea, to put money aside to coincide with the stabilization idea.
And at this point, in this budget process, we can do that. And just hypothetically, we can say,